Supported by the most unexpected allies, you'll see how one moment of courage can inspire an entire community to stand up against powerful predators. So grab your headphones, settle in, and prepare for a story that will make you believe in the power of women supporting women, the strength found in starting over, and the beautiful truth that real family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. Trust me, you won't want to pause this one. You worthless piece of trash. The slap echoed through Romano's restaurant as Grace Hamilton's hand flew to her 6 months pregnant belly, the sound cutting through the gentle murmur of anniversary dinners and first dates like a gunshot. Grace stood frozen beside their corner table, her cheek burning from her millionaire ex-husband's palm, though he wasn't her ex yet. The candlelit restaurant fell silent, 50 pairs of eyes turning toward them like flowers following the sun. Her hand instinctively protected the life growing inside her, a gesture that had become second nature over the past 6 months. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the classical music that continued playing, oblivious to the drama unfolding. "Please, not here, not tonight." But Marcus Hamilton, heir to Hamilton tech fortune and master of his own digital empire, wasn't finished with his performance. His face, normally composed for board meetings and charity galas, twisted with the kind of rage that money usually helped him hide. "Don't you dare embarrass me in public. Grace, do you have any idea who I am, who we are?" His voice carried across the restaurant, each word dripping with the narcissistic abuse that had become their marriage's soundtrack. Grace's mind raced back to how the evening had started, their 4th wedding anniversary. She'd worn the blue dress Marcus liked, the one that still fit despite her growing belly. They'd driven to Romano's in his Tesla, discussing baby names and nursery colors like a normal couple preparing for their first child. Everything changed when their waitress approached the table. Stella Rivers was 24, blonde, and possessed the kind of effortless beauty that turned heads without trying. She'd introduced herself with a bright smile, taking their drink orders with professional warmth. Grace had ordered sparkling water with lime. Marcus had ordered a whiskey, neat, and hadn't taken his eyes off Stella once. "That's a lovely necklace," Marcus had said, his voice taking on the smooth tone he used when closing business deals. "Is it vintage?" Stella had touched the small silver pendant at her throat, a nervous gesture that Grace recognized from her own early dating days. "Thank you. It was my grandmother's." "It suits you. You have excellent taste." Marcus's smile was predatory, practiced. "I'm Marcus Hamilton, Hamilton Tech. Perhaps you've heard of us?" Grace had felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with pregnancy nausea. She'd seen that look before, in the early days of their relationship when Marcus was still hunting. But back then, she'd been the prey. "Marcus," she'd said quietly, "maybe we should focus on our anniversary dinner." He'd turned that same charming smile on her, but his eyes remained flat. "Of course, darling. Forgive me." "Stella, my wife gets a bit sensitive about business networking. Pregnancy hormones. You understand." The dismissive comment had stung, but Grace had bitten her tongue. She'd learned to pick her battles with Marcus, especially in public. His need to maintain his image as the perfect husband and CEO meant their fights happened behind closed doors, where his words cut deeper but left no visible marks. Stella had shifted uncomfortably, clearly picking up on the tension. "I'll get your drinks right away." As the evening progressed, Marcus's attention to their waitress became impossible to ignore. He complimented her service repeatedly, asked personal questions about her background, and left a $100 tip on their appetizer alone. "She's working her way through acting school," Marcus announced after Stella mentioned her auditions. "I know several people in entertainment. Perhaps I could make some introductions." Grace watched Stella's face light up with hope and felt a mixture of pity and anger. The young woman had no idea she was being hunted by a man whose idea of helping usually came with strings attached. "That's very kind," Stella had said, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense. I believe in supporting young talent. Here's my card. Call my office tomorrow." That's when Grace had finally spoken up. "Marcus, I don't think that's appropriate." The temperature at their table dropped 10 degrees. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Grace recognized the warning signs. But pregnancy had given her a courage she hadn't possessed in years, the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. "I'm sorry," Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. Our anniversary dinner isn't the place to conduct business, especially with women half your age. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Stella had excused herself to check on other tables, sensing the coming storm. Are you questioning my judgment? Grace, I'm questioning your priorities. That's when Marcus had stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Other diners had begun to notice their raised voices, their body language. Grace had seen the exact moment Marcus decided he didn't care about their audience anymore. You've been impossible since you got pregnant, questioning everything I do, criticizing my business decisions, acting like you have any idea what it takes to run my company. Your company, Grace's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. I worked in marketing for 6 years before we married. I understand business perfectly well. You understand nothing. You sit at home spending my money while I work 16-hour days to maintain the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to. The cruelty in his voice cut through her like a blade. Grace looked around the restaurant, seeing the curious faces, the cell phones being subtly positioned to record their domestic drama. The financial independence she'd once known felt like a distant memory, another casualty of a marriage built on control rather than love. I gave up my career because you asked me to, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. I trusted you when you said we'd be partners. Partners? Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. You're my wife, Grace. That means you support me, not undermine me in front of strangers. I'm not undermining you. I'm trying to save you from yourself. That's when he'd slapped her. Now, standing in the aftermath with her cheek throbbing and her unborn daughter moving restlessly in her womb, Grace realized that something fundamental had shifted. The mask Marcus wore for the world had finally slipped completely. Sir! The voice came from behind Marcus, calm but carrying unmistakable authority. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from your wife. Grace looked past her husband to see a man in his 50s approaching their table. He wore the black suit and name tag of restaurant management, but his bearing suggested military background. His graying hair was precisely cut, and his eyes held the kind of steady calm that came from facing real danger. Frank Rivers, he introduced himself, extending a hand to Grace while carefully positioning himself between her and Marcus. I'm the manager here at Romano's. Marcus whirled around, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. This is none of your business. This is between my wife and me. Actually, sir, when it happens in my restaurant, it becomes my business. Frank's voice remained level, professional. We don't tolerate violence against women here, especially pregnant women. Violence? Marcus's voice climbed higher. I barely touched her. She's being dramatic. Grace felt something crack inside her chest. The man she'd married, the man whose children she was carrying, had just dismissed her assault as drama. The women supporting women movement she'd always admired from a distance suddenly felt very personal. I think you need to leave, Frank said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I could buy this restaurant tomorrow and have you fired before lunch. That's your choice, sir. But tonight, you need to leave. Grace watched her husband's face cycle through rage, disbelief, and calculation. She'd seen this process countless times during their marriage, Marcus figuring out how to win, how to control the narrative, how to make himself the victim. Grace, he said, his voice suddenly soft, concerned. Come on, honey, let's go home. You're tired, and stress isn't good for the baby. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that Grace almost believed it herself. Almost. But the sting on her cheek and the protective weight of Frank's presence reminded her that this wasn't about pregnancy hormones or misunderstandings. No, she said quietly. Marcus blinked. What? I said no. Grace's voice grew stronger. I'm not going anywhere with you tonight. The restaurant remained silent, the entire room holding its breath. Grace could feel the weight of their attention, but for the first time in years, she didn't care about appearances or social expectations. She cared about the life growing inside her and what kind of world she was bringing her daughter into. Grace, you're being ridiculous. We had a small disagreement. Married couples fight. Married couples don't hit each other in restaurants, Frank interjected quietly. Marcus spun toward the manager, his face contorting with rage. Stay out of this, old man. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Actually, sir, I have a very clear idea. That's when Grace noticed Stella standing behind Frank, her face pale but determined. The young waitress was holding a small recording device, and her eyes were fixed on Marcus with unmistakable disgust. Stella caught the whole thing on her phone, Frank said quietly. The question is what happens next. Marcus looked between the manager, the waitress, and his pregnant wife, and Grace could see him calculating odds, weighing consequences, planning his next move. But for once in their marriage, she was one step ahead of him. I want you to call the police, Grace said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent restaurant. I want to file charges for assault. The words hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Marcus's face went white, then red, then white again. You wouldn't dare, he whispered. Grace looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The charming man who'd courted her with expensive dinners and weekend getaways had been replaced by someone capable of hitting a pregnant woman in public. The midlife transformation she'd thought would be about becoming a mother was apparently going to be about becoming herself again. Watch me, she said. Frank Rivers had managed upscale restaurants for 20 years, but he'd never seen anything quite like Marcus Hamilton's public meltdown. As the manager called 911 on his cell phone, Frank positioned himself strategically between the increasingly agitated billionaire and his pregnant wife. You have no idea what you're doing, Marcus hissed, his voice low but carrying clearly in the hushed restaurant. I will destroy this place. I will destroy all of you. Grace remained seated at their table, one hand still protectively covering her belly. Frank noticed she was trembling slightly, but her voice stayed steady when she spoke. Let him threaten us. Frank, I want everyone to hear what kind of man my millionaire ex-husband really is. The phrase cut through Marcus like a blade. Ex-husband. Grace had never used those words before, even during their worst fights. Frank watched the businessman's face cycle through denial, rage, and something that might have been fear. We're not divorced, Grace. You can't just decide we're over because you're having an emotional breakdown. An emotional breakdown, Grace's voice rose, and Frank heard the steel that had been missing from her earlier responses. You slapped me in a restaurant full of people because I asked you to stop flirting with our waitress? That's not an emotional breakdown, that's clarity. Stella moved closer to Frank, still holding her phone steady. The young woman's face was pale, but her hand wasn't shaking. Frank felt a surge of pride in his daughter's courage, though Marcus still didn't know about their relationship. Sir, Frank addressed Marcus directly, the police are on their way. I strongly suggest you wait quietly until they arrive. Marcus pulled out his own phone, scrolling through contacts with sharp, angry movements. We'll see about that. My lawyer will have this entire situation dismissed before midnight. Your lawyer wasn't here when you hit your pregnant wife. Frank replied calmly. My security cameras were. The color drained from Marcus's face. In his rage, he'd forgotten about surveillance. Frank had installed the camera system himself after 3 incidents of harassment toward female staff members. He'd never expected to use the footage to protect a customer from her own husband. You're recording private conversations without consent, Marcus said, grasping for legal ground. That's inadmissible in court. Actually, sir, this is a public establishment. You have no expectation of privacy here. Frank had dealt with enough drunk executives and entitled customers to know the law. And assault is assault, regardless of who your lawyer is. Grace looked up at Frank with something approaching wonder. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know why you're helping me, but thank you. Frank met her eyes and saw something that reminded him of Stella at 18, young, trusting, and learning too late that charm could mask cruelty. Every woman deserves respect, ma'am, especially in my restaurant. Your restaurant, Marcus latched onto the words. I thought you were just the manager. I manage it for the owner. Frank replied carefully. He wasn't about to reveal that he'd been saving to buy Romanos from James Crawford for the past 3 years. His military disability payments and restaurant income had finally made ownership possible. But he didn't need Marcus Hamilton targeting his dreams along with everything else. The sound of sirens grew louder outside, and Frank watched Marcus's demeanor shift from aggressive to calculating. The businessman straightened his tie, smoothed his hair, and adopted the expression Frank had seen on countless politicians caught in scandals concerned, slightly confused and utterly innocent. "Officers," Marcus called out as two police officers entered the restaurant. "Thank God you're here. My wife is having some kind of breakdown. Pregnancy can be very difficult, and she's not thinking clearly." Grace started to speak, but Frank touched her shoulder gently. "Let them ask questions first," he murmured. "Don't let him control the narrative." Officer Martinez approached their table, her partner flanking the group. She was young, Latina, and had the kind of alert eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Officer Martinez. We received a call about a domestic disturbance. Can someone tell me what happened here?" Marcus immediately launched into his prepared story. "My wife and I were having a private discussion about our anniversary plans when she became upset. She's been very emotional during her pregnancy, and I think the stress of the restaurant environment overwhelmed her." Frank watched Grace's face as her husband painted her as unstable, hysterical, and unreliable. The narcissistic abuse was so smooth, so practiced, that Frank could see how it might work on someone who didn't know Marcus's history. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez turned to Grace. "Is that what happened?" Grace took a deep breath, her hand moving protectively over her pregnant belly. "No, officer. My husband slapped me when I asked him to stop flirting with our waitress. Everyone in the restaurant saw it." "That's completely untrue," Marcus interjected smoothly. "She's been increasingly paranoid and accusatory. I barely touched her arm to help her sit down when she became dizzy." Frank stepped forward. "Officer, I have the entire incident on security camera. Mr. Hamilton struck his wife across the face hard enough that the sound carried across the restaurant." Marcus's confident expression flickered. "Security cameras can be misleading. Angles, lighting, they don't tell the whole story. They tell enough." Stella spoke up for the first time, stepping forward with her phone. "I recorded it too. From my angle, it's very clear what happened." Officer Martinez looked at the young waitress with interest. "And you are Stella Rivers. I was serving their table when the incident occurred." Frank felt his chest tighten as his daughter stepped into the spotlight. He'd spent years protecting Stella from exactly this kind of situation. Powerful men who believed money made them untouchable. Now she was volunteering to testify against a billionaire. "Can I see the recording?" Officer Martinez asked. Stella handed over her phone, and Frank watched the officer's expression change as she viewed the footage. The slap was clearly visible, as was Grace's protective gesture toward her belly. "Mr. Hamilton," Officer Martinez said, her tone noticeably cooler. "This recording shows you striking your pregnant wife. That constitutes domestic assault." Marcus's mask finally slipped completely. "Do you have any idea who I am? I employ half this city through my businesses. I contribute millions to the police benevolent fund. I'm not some common criminal you can arrest on the word of restaurant staff. Sir, assault is assault, regardless of your bank account." Frank felt a spark of respect for the young officer. He'd seen too many cops intimidated by wealth and status. Martinez seemed cut from different cloth. "I want to press charges," Grace said clearly, "and I want a restraining order." Marcus whirled on her, his composure finally cracking completely. "You ungrateful—" "Sir, step back," Officer Martinez commanded, her hand moving instinctively toward her radio. "Don't make this situation worse." Frank watched Marcus struggle with his own rage, his face cycling through expressions like a man fighting internal war. The businessman was clearly unaccustomed to being told what to do by anyone, much less a young Latina police officer and a pregnant woman. "Grace," Marcus said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that Frank recognized as another manipulation tactic. "Think about our baby. Think about our life together. You can't destroy our family over a misunderstanding." "I'm not destroying our family, Marcus. I'm protecting it." The simple dignity in Grace's response seemed to land like a physical blow. Marcus staggered slightly, and Frank wondered if this was the first time anyone had stood up to the man without backing down. "Mrs. Hamilton," Officer Martinez addressed Grace directly. "If you want to press charges, we'll need you to come to the station to file a formal complaint. I'll drive her," Frank offered immediately. Marcus's head snapped toward the manager. "And who exactly are you in all this? What's your stake in destroying my marriage?" Frank met the younger man's eyes steadily. I don't have a stake in your marriage, sir. I have a stake in preventing men from hitting women in my establishment. Your establishment? You said you were just the manager. I manage it. That makes it mine to protect. Something in Frank's tone seemed to register with Marcus, the quiet authority of someone who'd faced real danger and come out stronger. Frank had seen combat in Afghanistan before injury brought him home. He'd faced down armed insurgents and survived IED explosions. One entitled billionaire didn't intimidate him. Fine, Marcus spat, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot. As Officer Martinez began the process of taking statements, Frank noticed other restaurant patrons recording the scene with their phones. In the age of social media, Marcus Hamilton's public meltdown would be online within hours. The businessman seemed to realize this too. His eyes darted around the room, cataloging faces, probably planning lawsuits and intimidation tactics. But for once in his privileged life, Marcus Hamilton had lost control of the narrative. Frank looked at Grace, still sitting with quiet dignity despite the trauma of the evening, and made a decision that would change everything. Stella, he called to his daughter. Come here for a minute. The young woman approached, and Frank put a protective arm around her shoulders. Mrs. Hamilton, Frank said clearly, I think it's time you met my daughter. The revelation hit the restaurant like a thunderclap. Grace looked between Frank Rivers and Stella, seeing the resemblance now that she knew to look for it, the same steady gray eyes, the same determined chin, the same protective stance. Your daughter, Grace's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus, who had been pacing near the hostess station while Officer Martinez took statements from other diners, froze mid-step, his head whipped around, and Grace saw genuine shock replace his practiced indignation. Stella is my daughter, Frank confirmed, his arm tightening protectively around the young woman's shoulders. She's been working here part-time while she pursues her acting career. Oh my God, Grace breathed, the full impact hitting her. Stella, I'm so sorry. I thought you were, when Marcus was, you thought I was flirting back with him. Stella finished quietly. Her face was pale but determined. I wasn't. I was being polite because he was a customer, but I could see what he was doing. I've dealt with men like your husband before. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. Men like him, Frank's expression darkened. Powerful men who think young women in service industries are their personal entertainment. Men who believe money entitles them to whatever they want. Marcus had gone completely still, his calculating mind clearly working through the implications. Grace could practically see him reassessing the evening's events through this new lens. You set me up, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. Nobody set you up, sir, Frank replied calmly. You set yourself up the moment you started treating my daughter like she was for sale. I was being friendly. I offered to help with her career. By giving her your business card after publicly humiliating your pregnant wife, Stella stepped forward, and Grace heard steel in her voice that reminded her of Frank. By asking for my phone number while she was in the bathroom, by suggesting we meet privately to discuss opportunities, Grace's hand flew to her mouth. He asked for your number. Marcus's face flushed red. That's taken completely out of context. No, it isn't, Stella said firmly. You wanted my number so we could discuss your connections in the entertainment industry, away from your wife, away from witnesses. Officer Martinez looked up from her notepad with renewed interest. Mr. Hamilton, is this true? I network for business purposes all the time, Marcus said weakly. With 24-year-old waitresses while your pregnant wife is in the bathroom, Frank's voice carried 20 years of contained anger. While you leave $100 tips and make comments about her appearance, Grace stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their 4-year marriage. The narcissistic abuse she'd endured privately was just the tip of the iceberg. Marcus was a predator, and she'd been too isolated to see the pattern. How many others have there been? She asked quietly. Marcus's eyes darted to her, then away. Grace, you're misunderstanding everything. How many other young women have you pursued while I was home pregnant with your child? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Around them, the restaurant hummed with whispered conversations and the soft clicks of phone cameras. Grace realized that whatever privacy their marriage might have had was over. Stella knelt beside Grace's chair, her young face full of compassion. "Mrs. Hamilton, I want you to know that I never would have encouraged him if I'd known he was married. When I saw his ring, I tried to redirect every conversation back to you and your anniversary." "You don't need to apologize," Grace said, touching Stella's hand. "You were doing your job. He was the one who was inappropriate." Frank watched this exchange with something approaching wonder. Two women who should have been positioned as rivals were supporting each other instead. The women supporting women movement he'd seen his daughter participate in was playing out in real time. "Stella," Frank said gently, "why don't you tell Mrs. Hamilton about the other times?" Grace's stomach dropped. "Other times?" Stella glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "Your husband has been coming here for about 6 months. Always alone, usually on weekdays during lunch. He's made inappropriate comments to several of our female staff members." 6 months, Grace's voice cracked. "He told me he'd never been here before tonight. He specifically requested to sit in sections served by younger women," Frank added. "He's asked 3 different servers for their phone numbers and made suggestive comments about helping their careers." Grace felt the walls of her marriage crumbling around her. Every business dinner Marcus had claimed to attend alone, every networking event that required him to stay late, every explanation that had seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, all of it took on a sinister new meaning. "The other women," she managed. "Did any of them?" "No," Frank said firmly. "I made sure of that, but only because I was watching. Only because I made sure he never got them alone." Marcus finally found his voice. "This is all lies. You're trying to destroy me because I embarrassed you in front of your customers." "You destroyed yourself," Frank replied evenly, "the moment you thought you could buy access to my daughter." Officer Martinez closed her notepad and approached the group. "Mr. Hamilton, based on multiple witness statements and video evidence, you're under arrest for domestic assault." "This is ridiculous," Marcus sputtered as she began reading him his rights. "My lawyers will have this thrown out before morning." "That's your right, sir. But tonight, you're coming with us." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Marcus looked directly at Grace. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. You have no idea how to survive without me." Grace felt something shift inside her chest, like a lock finally opening after years of being jammed. "I survived just fine before I met you. Marcus, I'll survive even better without you." Frank watched the police escort Marcus from the restaurant, then turned his attention back to Grace. She was still seated at the table where her marriage had effectively ended, her hand protectively covering her pregnant belly. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said gently, "do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" Grace looked up at him with eyes that were clearer than they'd been all evening. "I have a friend who's been telling me to leave him for months. I think it's time I listened to her." "I'll drive you," Stella offered immediately. "You don't have to." "Yes, we do," Frank interjected. "What happened here tonight isn't just between you and your husband anymore. Marcus Hamilton is going to blame everyone in this restaurant for his humiliation. We need to stick together." Grace looked around Romano's, taking in the concerned faces of staff and customers who had witnessed her midlife transformation from trophy wife to independent woman. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. "There's something else you should know," Frank said carefully. "The security footage from tonight is going to be evidence in your case. But in today's world, these things have a way of going viral." Grace considered this, then nodded slowly. "Good. Let people see what he really is." Stella squeezed her hand. "Are you sure once it's out there, you can't take it back?" "I can't take back being slapped in public either," Grace replied. "The difference is, now I get to control what happens next." As Frank helped Grace gather her purse and coat, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. His daughter had found her courage, a woman had found her strength, and a bully had finally faced consequences. The financial independence Grace had given up when she married Marcus would be harder to rebuild, but Frank had seen enough strong women to know it was possible. His own ex-wife had started over at 40 after their divorce and built a successful consulting business. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said as they prepared to leave, "tomorrow is going to be difficult. The media, the lawyers, the aftermath of tonight is going to get ugly before it gets better." Grace paused at the restaurant entrance, her hand on the door. Behind them, Romano's staff was cleaning up the debris of her shattered marriage. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, legal battles, and the challenge of single motherhood. "Frank," she said, and her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. "After 4 years of being married to Marcus Hamilton, I think I can handle ugly." As they walked out into the night air, Stella fell into step beside Grace, and Frank followed, watching two generations of women supporting each other toward whatever came next. The Hamilton estate sat on 15 acres of manicured Connecticut countryside, but Grace had never felt more trapped than she did walking through its marble foyer at 2 in the morning. The house felt enormous and empty, without Marcus's dominating presence, though she knew that would change soon enough. Rebecca Mitchell was waiting in the kitchen with a pot of coffee and a legal pad covered in notes. Grace's best friend and divorce attorney had driven straight from Manhattan after Grace's tearful phone call from the police station. "How are you holding up?" Rebecca asked, wrapping Grace in a careful hug that accommodated her pregnant belly. "I keep expecting to wake up," Grace admitted, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs that cost more than most people's cars. "6 hours ago, I thought I was going to have a nice anniversary dinner. Now my millionaire ex-husband is in jail, and I'm planning to leave him." "He's not your ex-husband yet," Rebecca corrected gently. "But we're going to fix that. Tell me everything that happened at the restaurant." As Grace recounted the evening's events, Rebecca took methodical notes. Her friend had built her reputation handling high-asset divorces, particularly cases involving narcissistic abuse and financial control. She knew Marcus's type intimately. "The waitress recorded everything?" Rebecca asked. "Stella. Her father is the restaurant manager who called police. They both witnessed the entire incident." "Good. Video evidence makes this much stronger. What about Marcus's reaction when he was arrested?" Grace closed her eyes, remembering. He kept saying his lawyers would have everything dismissed by morning. He seemed more angry about the public humiliation than concerned about hitting me. Rebecca nodded grimly. "Classic behavior. Men like Marcus see assault charges as inconveniences, not consequences. He's probably already calculating how to spin this to his advantage." As if summoned by their conversation, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Gracie, it's Marcus. They took my phone but let me call my lawyer. This whole thing is a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. Come bail me out and we'll put this behind us. Think about our baby." Grace showed the message to Rebecca, who immediately started typing notes. "He's trying to minimize and manipulate." Rebecca observed, "The pet name Gracie is designed to make you remember when you were happy together. The appeal to the baby is emotional blackmail." "I'm not bailing him out," Grace said firmly. "Good. Let him sit in jail overnight. It might be the first time in his life he's faced real consequences." Grace's phone buzzed again. "My lawyer says you're making a huge mistake. I employ 600 people in this state. I contribute to every major charity. One phone call from me could ruin the restaurant manager and that little waitress. Don't let them destroy our family." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Now he's threatening witnesses. Screenshot that message, it's evidence of intimidation." As Grace complied, her phone began ringing. The caller ID showed Marcus's lawyer, David Stern, whom Grace had met at numerous social functions. "Don't answer," Rebecca advised. "Let it go to voicemail." The voicemail was brief but telling. "Grace, this is David Stern. I need you to call me immediately. We need to discuss tonight's incident before it gets out of hand. Marcus is concerned about your well-being and the stress this is putting on your pregnancy." "He's building a defense strategy," Rebecca explained, "painting Marcus as the concerned husband and you as the unstable pregnant woman. We need to get ahead of this." "Oh, how?" "By filing for divorce tomorrow morning, and by getting our own version of events on record before his PR team takes control of the narrative." Grace's phone buzzed with another text, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Hamilton, this is Channel 7 News. We understand you were involved in an incident at Romano's restaurant tonight. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to tell your side of the story before it appears on social media." Rebecca and Grace stared at the message in silence. "It's starting," Rebecca said quietly. "Someone at the restaurant must have posted the video already." Grace opened her social media apps and began searching. It didn't take long to find multiple posts tagged with #Romano's incident and #billionaire assault. The video Stella had taken was already circulating, along with several other angles from restaurant patrons. The comments were brutal but divided. Some users expressed outrage at Marcus's behavior, while others questioned Grace's motives and suggested she was seeking attention or money. "Look at this one," Grace said, showing Rebecca a particularly vicious comment. "She says I probably deserved it for embarrassing my husband in public." "Don't read the comments," Rebecca advised firmly. "Nothing good ever comes from reading comments, but this confirms we need to control the narrative quickly." Grace's landline began ringing the house phone that only close friends and family used. The caller ID showed Marcus's mother, Dorothy Hamilton. "Should I answer?" "Yes, but put it on speaker. I want to hear how the family responds." Grace answered with trembling fingers. "Hello, Dorothy." "Grace, darling, I just heard the most ridiculous story from David Stern. He claims Marcus was arrested for hitting you. That can't possibly be true." Grace took a deep breath. "It is true, Dorothy. He slapped me at Romano's restaurant because I asked him to stop flirting with our waitress." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Grace," Dorothy's voice was carefully controlled, "I need you to think very carefully about what you're saying. Accusations like this can destroy a man's reputation permanently. His reputation should be destroyed. He hit his pregnant wife in public. Marriage is complicated, dear. Sometimes couples have disagreements that look worse than they are. Marcus loves you and the baby. He would never intentionally hurt you." Grace felt something inside her chest crack open. Dorothy Hamilton, the woman who had welcomed Grace into the family and insisted she call her mom, was choosing her son over the truth. "Dorothy, there's video evidence. Multiple witnesses. He didn't just hit me, he's been pursuing other women for months." "That's impossible. Marcus is devoted to you. He asked our 24-year-old waitress for her phone number while I was in the bathroom." Another long silence. "Grace." Dorothy's voice took on a tone Grace had never heard before. "I think the stress of pregnancy is affecting your judgment. Perhaps you should see a doctor before making any rash decisions." Rebecca held up a note. "She's gaslighting you. Classic family enabler behavior." "Dorothy, I'm not crazy. I'm not confused. Your son assaulted me, and I'm leaving him. Think about what you're saying. Grace, think about your future. Marcus provides everything for you. Your house, your security, your lifestyle. What will you do without him?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Grace looked around the marble kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and imported fixtures, all purchased with Marcus's money. For 4 years, she'd traded her financial independence for luxury and security. Now that security felt like a prison. "I'll figure it out," Grace said quietly. "Will you? Do you have any idea how expensive it is to raise a child alone? How difficult it is for single mothers to maintain any quality of life?" Rebecca was shaking her head vigorously, but Grace could hear the doubt creeping into her own mind. She hadn't worked in 4 years. Her marketing skills were probably rusty. The job market was competitive, and employers often discriminated against pregnant women despite legal protections. "Dorothy, I can't stay married to a man who hits me." One incident. Grace, one moment of poor judgment during a stressful evening. Is that really worth destroying everything you've built together? Grace closed her eyes and felt her daughter moving restlessly in her womb. What kind of world was she bringing this child into? What kind of example would she set if she stayed with a man who assaulted her? "Yes," she said firmly. "It is." Dorothy's voice turned cold. "Then you're making a terrible mistake. Marcus will fight this divorce with everything he has. He'll claim you're an unfit mother. He'll use your pregnancy to argue that you're emotionally unstable. He'll ensure you get as little as possible in any settlement." The threats were delivered in the same calm tone Dorothy used to discuss charity luncheons and garden parties. Grace realized that Marcus hadn't learned his cruelty in a vacuum. "Is that what you want, Dorothy? Your son destroying the mother of his child out of spite?" "I want what's best for my family, and right now, that means protecting Marcus from false accusations and helping you see reason." Grace looked at Rebecca, who was scribbling furiously on her legal pad. Her friend held up a note. "Record this call. Voice memo app." Grace quietly activated her phone's recording feature. "Dorothy, what if it was your daughter instead of your son? What if your daughter-in-law slapped your daughter while she was pregnant? That's different. That would never happen. Why? Because women don't hit men, or because you raised your sons better than that. Grace, you're being deliberately difficult. Marcus made a mistake. Everyone deserves forgiveness. Forgiveness and consequences aren't mutually exclusive. I can forgive Marcus while still protecting myself and my daughter. Your daughter, Dorothy's voice sharpened. You found out the gender. Grace realized her slip too late. She and Marcus had decided to wait until birth to learn their baby's sex, but the ultrasound technician had accidentally revealed it during her last appointment. It doesn't matter, Grace said. It matters to me. That's my granddaughter you're talking about. You can't deprive her of her father over one incident. I'm not depriving her of anything. I'm making sure she grows up knowing that men don't get to hit women, even when they're married to them. Dorothy's response was swift and cutting. You're making sure she grows up poor and fatherless. I hope you're proud of yourself. The line went dead. Grace sat in her marble kitchen, surrounded by wealth and luxury, and realized she had never felt more alone. But as her daughter moved restlessly in her womb, Grace knew she was making the right choice. How bad is this going to get? She asked Rebecca. Her friend looked up from her notes, and her expression was grim but determined. It's going to get very bad before it gets better. But Grace, you're stronger than you know, and you're not alone in this fight. Outside, Grace could hear cars pulling into their circular driveway. Through the kitchen window, she saw news vans setting up for what would be a very long night. The midlife transformation she'd thought would be about becoming a mother was becoming something much bigger, a complete reinvention of who she was and what she would accept. Her phone buzzed with another message from Marcus. Last chance, Grace. Come bail me out, or I'll make sure you regret this for the rest of your life. Instead of fear, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years: clarity. She deleted the message without responding. Grace woke up in pain at 4 a.m, her lower back seizing with contractions that felt different from the Braxton Hicks episodes she'd experienced over the past month. Rebecca was asleep on the couch in the guest room, surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee cups from their late-night strategy session. Rebecca, Grace called out, her voice tight with concern. Something's wrong. Within minutes, they were driving through the pre-dawn darkness toward Greenwich Hospital. Rebecca's hands steady on the wheel while Grace timed contractions that were coming too frequently for comfort. It's too early, Grace whispered, her hands protectively covering her 6-month belly. She's not ready yet. Stress can trigger early labor, Rebecca said gently. But you're at 24 weeks. If something happens, the doctors can help her. The emergency room was mercifully quiet at this hour. Dr. Patricia Wells, Grace's obstetrician, arrived within 30 minutes of their call, her gray hair pulled back in a professional bun and her manner calmly reassuring. Let's see what's going on. Doctor, Wells said as she conducted her examination. Your cervix is slightly dilated, but the baby's heartbeat is strong. The contractions are likely stress-induced, but we're going to monitor you for the next several hours. As Grace settled into a hospital bed with monitors tracking her daughter's vital signs, Doctor, Wells pulled up a chair with the expression Grace had learned meant serious conversation time. Grace, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Rebecca told me about what happened last night. Has Marcus ever been physically aggressive with you before? Grace hesitated. The slap at Romano's had been the first time Marcus had actually hit her, but there had been other incidents: grabbing her wrist too tightly during arguments, blocking doorways when she tried to leave a room, looming over her in ways that felt threatening. Not exactly, Grace said carefully. What does not exactly mean? He's never hit me before last night, but he's grabbed me during fights, hard enough to leave marks. Doctor, Wells made notes in Grace's chart. Any other concerning behaviors? Grace thought about the isolation, the way Marcus had gradually separated her from friends and family, the financial control, the constant criticism disguised as concern. He's very controlling, she admitted. About money, about who I see, about what I do with my time. Classic patterns of narcissistic abuse. Doctor, Wells observed. Grace, the stress of living in that environment isn't healthy for you or the baby. Your blood pressure has been elevated at your last 3 appointments. I thought that was normal pregnancy hypertension. It can be, but chronic stress from an abusive relationship can also cause pregnancy complications, early labor, low birth weight, developmental issues. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. I didn't know it could affect her. Leaving an abusive relationship is one of the best things you can do for your daughter's health. Doctor, Wells said firmly. But the transition period can be dangerous. We need to monitor you closely over the next few weeks. A knock on the door interrupted them. Grace expected to see Rebecca returning with coffee, but instead found Frank Rivers standing in the doorway with a small bouquet of flowers and a concerned expression. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. I wanted to check on you after last night. Stella's been worried. You didn't have to come, Grace said, though she felt genuinely touched by the gesture. Actually, I did. What happened at my restaurant makes me partially responsible for your well-being. Doctor? Wells looked between them with interest. You're the restaurant manager who helped her press charges? Yes, ma'am. Frank Rivers. I'm glad someone was looking out for her. Doctor, Wells said. Grace needs all the support she can get right now. Frank pulled up a chair beside Grace's bed. How are you feeling? Scared, Grace admitted. About the baby, about the divorce, about what Marcus might do next. What do you mean, what he might do? Grace told him about the threatening text messages and Dorothy's phone call. Frank's expression grew darker with each detail. He's trying to isolate you, Frank observed. Turn his family against you. Make you feel like you have nowhere to go. Isn't that what abusers do? It's exactly what they do. But Grace, you do have somewhere to go. You have people who will support you. Like who I haven't had real friends in years. Marcus made sure of that. Frank leaned forward in his chair. You have Rebecca, you have me and Stella. You have Dr. Wells, who's clearly in your corner. You barely know me, Grace protested. I know enough. I know you protected your unborn daughter when your husband got violent. I know you stood up to him even when you were scared. I know you chose to press charges even though it would make your life more difficult. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to be alone. I haven't been financially independent in 4 years. Financial independence isn't just about money, Frank said gently. It's about knowing you can take care of yourself and make your own decisions. You've already started doing that. Have I? You called Rebecca instead of Marcus's lawyer. You refused to bail him out of jail. You're here taking care of your health instead of at home making excuses for his behavior. Those are all choices that put you and your daughter first. A commotion in the hallway outside caught their attention. Raised voices, the sound of someone arguing with hospital security. Grace's heart sank as she recognized one of the voices. That's Marcus, she whispered. Through the small window in her door, Grace could see her husband being restrained by 2 security guards while a woman in a business suit spoke tersely on her phone. Marcus was still wearing the expensive suit from their anniversary dinner, now wrinkled from a night in jail. Mrs. Hamilton, he called out when he spotted her through the window. I need to see my wife. She's carrying my child. Frank stood up immediately. I'll handle this. No, Grace said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I need to face this myself. Doctor. Wells stepped into the hallway to speak with Marcus, her professional demeanor cool but polite. Mr. Hamilton, visiting hours don't begin until 8 a.m., and only people on Mrs. Hamilton's approved list are permitted in the maternity ward. I'm her husband, Marcus said, his voice carrying the entitled tone Grace knew so well. You can't keep me from seeing my wife and baby. Actually, I can. Mrs. Hamilton has requested that you not be allowed access while she's receiving medical treatment. Grace watched her husband's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and calculation. She'd seen this process countless times, but never from the safety of a hospital bed with medical professionals and friends protecting her. Grace, Marcus called out, his voice taking on the pleading tone that used to work so effectively. Honey, please. I know you're upset, but we can work through this. Think about our baby. Think about our family. The words that had once made her doubt herself now sounded hollow and manipulative. Grace realized that physical distance and the presence of witnesses had broken Marcus's spell over her. Mr. Hamilton? Doctor? Wells continued. Your wife is experiencing pregnancy complications that appear to be stress-related. Your presence would be medically contraindicated. Stress-related complications. Marcus's lawyer, the woman in the business suit, stepped forward. Are you saying my client's presence is harmful to his wife's health? I'm saying that any source of stress is potentially harmful to a high-risk pregnancy. Grace watched Marcus process this information, seeing him realize that his own behavior had potentially endangered his child. For a moment, she thought she saw genuine remorse in his expression. Grace, he said quietly, I never meant for any of this to hurt you or the baby. Please, just give me 5 minutes to explain. Against her better judgment, Grace found herself considering his request. The man she'd fallen in love with seemed to be speaking through the mask of the abuser she'd lived with for 4 years. Frank must have sensed her wavering. Grace, he said gently, you don't owe him anything. Not an explanation, not forgiveness, not even 5 minutes of your time. But what if he's sincere? What if he really wants to make things right? Then he can demonstrate that through actions, not words. He can attend anger management counseling. He can respect your need for space. He can stop sending threatening text messages and hiring lawyers to intimidate you. Grace looked at Marcus through the window, really looked at him, and saw the truth Frank was trying to show her. Her husband wasn't standing in the hallway because he was worried about her health. He was there because his control was slipping, and he needed to reassert dominance over the situation. No, Grace said clearly. I don't want to see him. Doctor. Wells nodded and returned to the hallway. Mr. Hamilton, Mrs. Hamilton has declined your request for a visit. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. This is ridiculous, Marcus exploded. I have rights as a husband and father. Your rights don't extend to disrupting medical treatment, Doctor, Wells replied calmly. Hospital security will escort you out. As Grace watched her husband being led away, still protesting his innocence and demanding his rights, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. How do you feel? Frank asked gently. Grace considered the question seriously. Her marriage was over. Her financial security was uncertain, and she was facing the prospect of single motherhood while her daughter's father fought her every step of the way. Free, she said finally. For the first time in 4 years, I feel free. Doctor. Wells returned to the room with a satisfied expression. Your blood pressure has already started to normalize. I think we can discharge you this afternoon if the contractions continue to subside. What happens next? Grace asked. You take care of yourself and your daughter. You let your support system help you. And you remember that leaving an abusive relationship was the bravest thing you could do. Frank squeezed Grace's hand gently. You're going to be okay, both of you. For the first time since walking into Romano's restaurant the night before, Grace believed him. By the time Grace was discharged from the hospital that afternoon, #billionaire slap's wife was trending on 3 social media platforms. Rebecca drove her to a small hotel outside Greenwich, while Frank followed in his car, both of them trying to shield her from the reporters who had somehow discovered her location. Don't look at your phone, Rebecca advised as they checked into adjoining rooms under false names. The internet is not a kind place right now, but Grace couldn't help herself. Lying on the hotel bed while Rebecca ordered room service, she scrolled through hundreds of posts, comments, and news articles about her marriage's public destruction. The video from Romano's had been shared thousands of times, often with commentary that made Grace's stomach churn. Some users defended her, calling Marcus a monster and praising her courage. Others questioned her motives, suggesting she'd provoked the incident for attention or money. Look at her body language. One comment read, she's clearly baiting him, gold digger trying to secure her payday. 6 months pregnant and she's worried about her husband talking to the waitress? Sounds like jealous wife syndrome to me. Read another, but there were supportive voices too. Women sharing their own stories of domestic violence, men condemning Marcus's behavior, people offering resources for abuse survivors. I stayed for 15 years because I thought I deserved it, one woman wrote. Seeing Grace Hamilton press charges gives me hope that I can find that strength too. Rebecca returned from the front desk with their room keys and immediately took the phone from Grace's hands. I told you not to read the comments. Some of them are supportive, Grace protested weakly. Some of them are also from Marcus's PR team. His crisis management company has been flooding social media with narrative control since this morning. Grace hadn't considered that possibility. You think he's paying people to attack me online? I think Marcus Hamilton didn't become a billionaire by letting other people control his story. He's going to fight this on every front: legal, financial, and public relations. A knock on the door interrupted them. Frank entered with Stella, both carrying bags of groceries and grim expressions. "It's getting ugly out there," Frank reported. "News vans outside Romano's. Reporters trying to interview customers from last night. Someone offering money for employee statements?" "Marcus's people," Grace asked. "Has to be. 3 different reporters asked me if I'd been paid to make false statements against your husband." Stella sat on the edge of Grace's bed, her young face troubled. "There are articles calling me a gold digger who seduced a married man. They're saying I planned the whole thing to get money or fame." "That's ridiculous," Grace said fiercely. "You were protecting me. I know that, and you know that. But the internet doesn't care about truth. It cares about drama." Frank pulled up a chair, his expression serious. "There's something else you need to know. Marcus held a press conference 2 hours ago." Grace felt her stomach drop. "What did he say?" Rebecca pulled out her laptop and found the video. Marcus stood behind a podium outside his lawyer's office, flanked by David Stern and a woman Grace didn't recognize, probably the crisis management specialist. "I want to address the unfortunate incident that occurred last night at Romano's restaurant," Marcus began, his voice carefully modulated to project concern and sincerity. "My wife Grace is 6 months pregnant with our first child, and the stress of impending parenthood has been overwhelming for both of us." Grace watched in horrified fascination as her husband transformed their private trauma into a public relations performance. Grace has been struggling with mood swings and paranoia throughout her pregnancy. "Last night, she became convinced that I was somehow inappropriate with our young waitress, despite my simply being polite and generous with service staff." "He's making me sound crazy," Grace whispered. When Grace became increasingly agitated and began making wild accusations in front of other diners, I attempted to calm her down by placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Unfortunately, she interpreted this as aggressive behavior. Marcus paused, allowing his carefully coached expression of concern to register with the cameras. "I love my wife deeply, and I'm committed to getting her the help she needs during this difficult time. We've already arranged for counseling and medical evaluation to address the psychological pressures of her pregnancy." Grace felt bile rise in her throat. Psychological pressures? Medical evaluation? "I'm asking the media and the public to respect our privacy during this challenging period. My wife is not well, and the attention this incident has received is only adding to her stress and potentially endangering our unborn child." The video ended with Marcus taking no questions and walking away, looking like a concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife. "He's claiming you're mentally ill," Rebecca said grimly. "It's a classic abuser tactic: attack the victim's credibility while positioning himself as the long-suffering partner." Grace stared at the frozen image of her husband's face on the laptop screen. His performance had been flawless, hitting every note designed to generate sympathy while discrediting her version of events. "Will people believe him? Some will," Frank admitted. "Men like Marcus are very good at seeming reasonable and sympathetic. But Grace, there are dozens of witnesses to what really happened, plus multiple video angles. The truth will come out. In the meantime, he's destroying my reputation." Stella leaned forward. "Not just yours. Look at this." She showed Grace several news articles that painted her as a manipulative gold digger who had somehow orchestrated the entire incident. "They're saying I deliberately flirted with your husband to create drama," Stella said. "That my father and I planned this together to extort money from Marcus." "That's insane," Grace said. "Insane but effective," Rebecca observed. "Marcus is using his money and influence to flood the zone with alternative narratives. By tomorrow, there will be so many competing versions of events that people won't know what to believe." Grace's phone rang. Dorothy Hamilton calling again. "Don't answer," Rebecca advised, but Grace was tired of running from confrontation. She accepted the call and put it on speaker. "Grace, dear, I just watched Marcus's press conference. He's so worried about you and the baby." "Dorothy, you saw the video from the restaurant. You know he hit me. I saw what appeared to be a misunderstanding between a stressed husband and his pregnant wife. Marcus explained everything. You've been having mood swings, paranoid episodes. It's not uncommon during pregnancy. Grace felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Dorothy's voice carried the same reasonable tone Marcus had used in his press conference, the same careful concern that made Grace question her own memories. I'm not paranoid, Dorothy. Marcus has been pursuing other women throughout our marriage. Grace, honey, that's exactly the kind of irrational jealousy Marcus was talking about. Pregnancy hormones can make women see threats that aren't there. Frank was shaking his head vigorously, holding up a note. She's gaslighting you. Trust your own experience. Dorothy, there are witnesses, restaurant employees who can testify to Marcus's inappropriate behavior with multiple women over months. Witnesses who work for a restaurant that could benefit financially from a scandal involving my son Grace. You need to think about who has ulterior motives here. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Dorothy was suggesting that Frank and Stella had manipulated her for money, that the people who had protected her were actually using her. That's not true, Grace said, but her voice sounded weak even to herself. Come home, dear. Let Marcus take care of you. You're not thinking clearly, and this stress can't be good for the baby. Grace looked around the hotel room at the people who had surrounded her with support. Rebecca, who had driven from Manhattan in the middle of the night. Frank, who had risked his job to protect her. Stella, who was facing public attack for standing up for a stranger. No, Grace said, her voice growing stronger. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Grace, Dorothy, your son hit me in public because I asked him to stop flirting with another woman. That's not a misunderstanding or a mood swing. That's abuse. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. I see, Dorothy said finally, her voice turning cold. Then you've made your choice. Don't expect the Hamilton family to support you through this fantasy. I don't expect anything from the Hamilton family except to be left alone. That can be arranged, but Grace, once you go down this path, there's no coming back. Marcus will fight you for custody. He'll ensure you get nothing in the divorce. You'll spend the rest of your life regretting this decision. Grace felt her daughter moving restlessly in her womb and thought about the world she wanted to create for her child. Maybe, she said, but at least I'll spend it free. Dorothy hung up without another word. Grace looked at her phone, where notifications continued to pour in. Friend requests from strangers, messages from reporters, comments on posts she hadn't made. Her private life had become public property, dissected and debated by people who had never met her. How do I survive this? She asked. Rebecca closed the laptop and took Grace's hand. One day at a time. We document everything. We build our case, and we trust that the truth will eventually matter more than Marcus's PR campaign. What if it doesn't? Frank stood up and moved to the window, checking the parking lot for reporters. Grace, I've seen a lot of bullies in my life. Military, civilian, doesn't matter, they all have the same weakness. What's that? They can't stand losing control. Marcus is throwing everything he has at you right now because he knows his power over you is broken. All this noise, all these threats, they're signs of desperation, not strength. Grace considered this, thinking about the Marcus she'd fallen in love with versus the man who had slapped her in a restaurant full of witnesses. He seemed so confident at that press conference. He seemed controlled, Stella corrected. There's a difference. Confidence doesn't require destroying other people. As evening fell over their hotel hideout, Grace realized that her midlife transformation was happening in real time. Broadcast to the world through social media and news coverage. The financial independence she'd traded away 4 years earlier would have to be rebuilt, but the emotional independence was already taking root. Her phone buzzed with one final message of the day, this one from a number she didn't recognize. Stay strong. My ex-husband tried the same tactics when I left him. It gets better. You're not alone. For the first time since walking into Romano's restaurant, Grace smiled. 3 days later, Grace was living in a small apartment Rebecca had found through her network of domestic violence attorneys. The furnished one-bedroom wasn't much to look at, but it had security cameras, controlled access, and most importantly, it was hers. Frank had been stopping by daily, bringing groceries and updates from Romano's. His steady presence reminded Grace of the father she'd lost when she was 22. Pragmatic, protective, but respectful of her independence. The reporters are finally leaving the restaurant alone, Frank reported as he unpacked groceries in her small kitchen. James is thinking about putting up a plaque commemorating the night you found your courage. Please don't, Grace said, though she was touched by the gesture. I don't want to be famous for being slapped. You're not famous for being slapped. You're famous for standing up after you were slapped. There's a difference. Grace was beginning to understand that difference, though the legal battle ahead still felt overwhelming. Rebecca had filed divorce papers that morning, and Marcus's response had been swift and vindictive. He's claiming I'm an unfit mother, Grace told Frank, showing him the legal documents that had arrived by courier. Mental instability, financial irresponsibility, endangering the pregnancy by refusing medical care. Frank's expression darkened as he read. Every accusation here is either false or twisted. You sought medical care when you needed it. You've been financially responsible with your own money, and the only mental instability in your marriage came from his abuse. Will a judge see it that way? A judge will see evidence, and we have plenty of that. Frank pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. I've been busy while you've been recovering. Security footage from Romano's going back 6 months, showing Marcus's pattern of inappropriate behavior with female staff. Incident reports I filed with the restaurant owner, documenting complaints from employees. Screenshots of online reviews mentioning Marcus's conduct. Grace stared at the folder. You documented all of this. I document everything that happens in my restaurant. It's how you protect your employees and your business. But why go to all this trouble for people you barely knew? Frank sat across from her at the small kitchen table, his weathered hands folded. Can I tell you about my daughter when she was 16? Grace nodded. Stella was working at a coffee shop after school, saving money for acting classes. This older man, wealthy businessman, started coming in regularly. Always wanted Stella to serve him. Always left big tips. Always had suggestions for her future. Grace felt a chill of recognition. One day, he offered to help her get into a prestigious acting program, said he had connections, could make introductions, but they needed to meet privately to discuss it. Stella was so excited she almost said yes. What stopped her? Me. I'd been watching this man operate, and I knew what he really wanted. So I had a conversation with my 16-year-old daughter about how predators use money and power to exploit young women. Grace thought about Stella's maturity during the restaurant incident, her immediate understanding of what was happening. You taught her to recognize the pattern. I taught her that her value isn't determined by what powerful men think of her. I taught her that saying no to inappropriate behavior doesn't make her ungrateful or difficult. It makes her smart. Frank opened the folder and showed Grace surveillance photos of Marcus from multiple visits to Romano's. When your husband started his regular lunch visits 6 months ago, I recognized the same pattern. Always requesting young female servers, always asking personal questions, always promising to help with their careers. You've been protecting them. I've been protecting all of them. But Grace, I couldn't protect you until you decided to protect yourself. The simple statement hit harder than any of Marcus's accusations or Dorothy's manipulations. Frank wasn't trying to rescue her. He was supporting her rescue of herself. I don't know how to do this, Grace admitted. The divorce, single motherhood, starting over at 30. I feel like I'm too old to rebuild my entire life. Frank smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. Grace, do you know how old I was when I left the military and started working in restaurants? 40-something. 47. I'd never worked in food service, never managed civilians, never dealt with the public on a daily basis. I had to learn everything from scratch. That's different. You chose to leave the military, and you chose to leave an abusive marriage. The circumstances don't matter as much as the decision to start over. Grace considered this, thinking about the marketing skills she'd developed before marriage, the education that couldn't be taken away, the strength she'd discovered over the past week. What if I mess up? What if I can't provide for her the way Marcus could? What if you raise her to be strong and independent instead of dependent on men who might hurt her? The question reframed everything. Grace had been thinking about what she was taking away from her daughter, the Hamilton wealth, the social status, the financial security. But what was she giving her instead? A mother who won't let anyone hit her. Grace said slowly, A mother who knows her own worth. A mother who chooses her own path. Frank pulled out another document from his folder, a job posting from a marketing firm in Hartford. Senior marketing consultant, part-time, flexible schedule, can work remotely. Rebecca knows the owner, another woman who rebuilt her career after divorce. Grace read the job description, feeling a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. The work sounded challenging, creative, completely different from the social obligations that had filled her days as Marcus's wife. "You think I could do this?" "Grace, you managed Marcus Hamilton's public image for 4 years. You made him look like a devoted husband when he was actually a serial predator. Those are high-level public relations skills. I was just being a good wife. You were doing professional quality image management without getting paid for it. Now you can do the same work for clients who will appreciate your expertise instead of taking it for granted." A knock at the door interrupted them. Grace tensed, but Frank checked the security monitor and relaxed. "It's Stella." The young woman entered with coffee and pastries from a bakery near her acting classes. She looked tired but determined, and Grace noticed she was carrying a thick folder of her own. "I've been doing some research," Stella announced, settling at the table with them. "About Marcus's business practices, his history with women, his family's financial dealings." "Stella, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. He's not just trying to destroy you. Grace, he's trying to destroy me and Dad too. So I'm fighting back." Frank looked at his daughter with pride and concern. "What did you find?" "Hamilton Tech has been sued 3 times in the past 5 years for sexual harassment. Always settled out of court, always with non-disclosure agreements. But I found court documents from before the settlements were reached." Grace stared at the folder. 3 lawsuits. 3 that made it to court. "I'm betting there were others that never got that far." Stella pulled out printouts of legal documents. "Look at the pattern, all young women, all employees or vendors, all describing the same behavior you witnessed at the restaurant." Frank leaned forward, studying the documents. "This establishes a clear pattern of predatory behavior." "It gets better," Stella continued. "I also found financial records showing that Marcus has been using company funds to settle these cases. That's embezzlement if the board of directors didn't approve it." Grace felt dizzy. "How did you find all this?" "I have friends in journalism school, friends in law school, friends who are really good with internet research. Plus, Marcus made enemies during those harassment cases, women who would love to see him face consequences." "This could destroy his company," Grace said. "His behavior could destroy his company," Frank corrected. "You're just making sure the truth comes out." As Grace reviewed Stella's research, she realized that her husband's pattern of abuse extended far beyond their marriage. The narcissistic abuse she'd endured privately was just one facet of a systematic exploitation of power. "There's something else," Stella said quietly. "I found records of private investigators Marcus hired to dig up dirt on the women who sued him. Financial records, personal relationships, medical history, anything he could use to discredit them. He's probably doing the same thing to me," Grace said. "Probably. But Grace, you're not hiding anything embarrassing. You're not the one with a pattern of predatory behavior. You're not the one who's been embezzling company funds to cover up harassment settlements." Frank gathered up all the documents and secured them in a large envelope. "We need to get this to Rebecca immediately. This changes the entire nature of your divorce case." "How?" "Because it's not just about one incident at a restaurant anymore. It's about a pattern of abuse that affects Marcus's fitness as a parent and his financial ability to support your daughter." Grace looked around her small apartment, cheap furniture, thin walls, nothing like the luxury she'd grown accustomed to as Mrs. Marcus Hamilton. But for the first time in months, she could breathe freely. "Frank," she said, "you asked me what kind of mother I want to be. I want to be the kind of mother who teaches her daughter that some things are more important than money." "Like what?" Grace thought about Stella's courage in standing up to a billionaire, Frank's willingness to risk his job to protect strangers, Rebecca's determination to fight for justice even when it would be easier to negotiate. "Like dignity," she said finally. "Like knowing that no amount of money is worth accepting abuse. Like understanding that real family isn't about blood or marriage contracts, it's about people who show up when you need them most." Frank smiled and squeezed her hand. "She's going to be lucky to have you as her mother." We're going to be lucky to have all of you in her life, Grace replied, looking between Frank and Stella. Both of you. As they prepared to deliver their evidence to Rebecca, Grace realized her midlife transformation wasn't just about leaving Marcus. It was about building a chosen family based on mutual respect rather than obligation. The women supporting women network she was joining felt more solid than any marriage contract she'd ever signed. 2 weeks later, Grace sat in Rebecca's law office watching her husband's empire crumble in real time. The evidence Frank and Stella had compiled, combined with Rebecca's legal expertise, had created a perfect storm that Marcus's expensive lawyers couldn't contain. Hamilton Tech's stock has dropped 30% since the harassment settlements went public, Rebecca reported, scrolling through financial news on her laptop. The board of directors is meeting this afternoon to discuss Marcus's future with the company. Grace felt no satisfaction in watching her husband's professional destruction. The Marcus she'd fallen in love with had possessed genuine talents, vision, intelligence, drive. But power and wealth had corrupted those gifts into tools for exploitation. What about the criminal case, Grace asked. The DA is moving forward with assault charges. The restaurant video, multiple witness statements, and Marcus's pattern of threatening behavior make it a strong case. Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. Grace, you're destroying innocent people to feed your vindictive fantasies. Think about our daughter. Rebecca saw Grace's expression and took the phone. He's using burner phones to circumvent the restraining order. We'll add this to the evidence file. He mentioned our daughter. How does he even know the ultrasound photos on your social media from last month? Rebecca explained gently. Before you went private, he probably figured out the gender from the pink-themed baby shower planning. Grace felt a chill. Marcus was monitoring her social media, analyzing her posts, maintaining surveillance even from a distance. The control that had defined their marriage was continuing despite physical separation. He's not going to stop, is he? Not until he faces real consequences. But Grace, that's exactly what's happening now. A knock on Rebecca's office door interrupted them. Her assistant entered with a grim expression. Miss Mitchell, there are reporters in the lobby. They're asking about the Hamilton case. Through the office window, Grace could see news vans lining the street below. The private legal matter she'd hoped to handle quietly had become a public spectacle. What do they want? Grace asked. Someone leaked the harassment settlement documents, Rebecca said, checking her phone. It's all over the financial news networks. Marcus Hamilton's pattern of abuse is front-page news. Grace felt exposed, vulnerable. The narcissistic abuse she'd suffered privately was being dissected by strangers, analyzed by legal experts, debated by people who had never met her. I can't go out there, she said. You don't have to. But Grace, this publicity is actually helping your case. Public pressure is forcing institutions to take Marcus's behavior seriously instead of protecting him. Rebecca's phone rang. Dorothy Hamilton calling. Don't answer, Grace said immediately. But Rebecca accepted the call and put it on speaker. This is Rebecca Mitchell. Miss Mitchell, this is Dorothy Hamilton. I need to speak with Grace immediately. Mrs. Hamilton, Grace has made it clear she doesn't wish to speak with you. This is about my granddaughter, about Grace's future. She needs to understand what she's destroying. Rebecca looked at Grace, who nodded reluctantly. Grace is here. You have 5 minutes. Dorothy's voice was strained, desperate in a way Grace had never heard before. Grace, darling, you have to stop this madness. The board is threatening to remove Marcus from his own company. The family's reputation is being destroyed. Everything we built, everything Marcus built was paid for with other women's silence. Grace interrupted. I'm not responsible for the consequences of his choices. His choices, Grace. You chose to publicize one moment of marital conflict instead of handling it privately. You chose to destroy a man's career over a simple misunderstanding. Grace felt the familiar doubt creeping in. The way Dorothy's reasonable tone made her question her own memories. Dorothy, it wasn't one moment. There were years of emotional abuse, financial control, and harassment of other women. The slap was just the first time he hit me in public. You're exaggerating, dear. Marcus provided everything for you. He loved you. Abusers often love their victims. Rebecca interjected professionally. Love and abuse aren't mutually exclusive? This is exactly what I mean, Dorothy said, her voice rising. You're listening to lawyers and strangers instead of family. You're letting them convince you that normal marital problems are abuse. Grace looked at Rebecca, then out the window at the reporters below, then down at her hands where faint bruises from Marcus's grip still lingered. Dorothy, normal marital problems don't involve police reports and restraining orders. Because you escalated things unnecessarily if you'd handled this privately, none of this would have happened. If I'd handled this privately, Marcus would have continued abusing me until he found someone younger and more controllable. The words came out with a clarity that surprised Grace. She hadn't fully articulated that truth before, even to herself. That's a terrible thing to say about your husband, Dorothy said. It's a terrible thing to be true about my husband. The silence stretched between them until Dorothy spoke again, her voice cold and final. Then you've made your choice, Grace. The Hamilton family will protect itself. Marcus will fight for full custody of his daughter. You'll get nothing in the divorce except what the law requires. And when you're struggling to raise that child alone, remember that you chose this. I chose safety over money, Grace replied. I chose my daughter's future over your family's reputation. You chose to be a single mother with no support system and no financial security. I chose to be free. Dorothy hung up without another word. Rebecca closed her phone and looked at Grace with something approaching awe. That was remarkably strong. I don't feel strong. I feel terrified. Good. You should be terrified. This is terrifying, but you're doing it anyway, which is the definition of courage. Grace's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Frank. Grace, are you safe? I'm seeing news reports about Hamilton Tech, and there are photographers outside Romano's again. I'm at Rebecca's office. We're okay. Good. Listen, there's something you need to know. Marcus tried to have me fired this morning. Grace felt her stomach drop. What? He called James, the restaurant owner, claiming I had fabricated evidence against him, said I was part of some conspiracy to extort money from his family. Did it work? Frank's voice carried a note of satisfaction. James told Marcus to go to hell. Apparently, 3 other restaurant owners in the area called this week with similar stories about Marcus's behavior. James is actually considering banning him from the entire restaurant group. Really? Really? Grace, you standing up to Marcus gave other people permission to tell their own stories. The women from his harassment settlements, restaurant workers he'd intimidated, business associates who'd watched him abuse his power, they're all coming forward now. Grace felt a strange mix of relief and responsibility. Her personal decision to press charges had opened floodgates she hadn't expected. I never wanted to destroy his entire life, she said quietly. You didn't destroy anything, Rebecca corrected. You exposed what was already there. The destruction is the natural consequence of Marcus's own behavior. Through the office window, Grace watched reporters interviewing people on the street, asking for opinions about domestic violence, financial abuse, and the responsibility of wealthy families to police their own members. This is bigger than just my divorce case, isn't it? Much bigger, Rebecca agreed. You've inadvertently become the face of a movement: successful women leaving abusive marriages, victims speaking truth to power, people choosing dignity over money. I just wanted him to stop hitting me. And that simple desire has revealed how many other women he was hurting. Grace, you started something you may not be able to control, but you definitely started something important. Grace's phone buzzed with a text from Stella. Saw the news. Dad and I are making dinner at your place tonight. No reporters allowed, just family. Family, not the family Grace had married into, with their conditional love and protective silence, but the family she was choosing: people who showed up during crisis, who offered support without expecting anything in return. Rebecca, Grace said, what happens now? Now we wait for the judge to review all evidence. We prepare for Marcus to fight dirty, because men like him always do. And we remember that truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it. Grace nodded, thinking about the daughter growing inside her, the world she was creating for that child through her choices today. Will it be worth it, all this pain and public exposure and financial uncertainty? Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Grace, what's the alternative staying married to a man who hits you? Raising a daughter who thinks that's normal? Teaching her that money is more important than dignity? No, Grace said firmly. That's not the world I want to create for her. Then yes, it will be worth it. Not immediately, and not without cost. But eventually, yes, it will be worth it. As they prepared to leave Rebecca's office through the back entrance to avoid reporters, Grace realized that her midlife transformation was no longer just personal. She had become a symbol, a test case, a woman whose choices would echo far beyond her own life. The financial independence she was fighting to rebuild might take years to achieve, but the emotional independence was already hers. And that, Grace thought, as she prepared to face whatever came next, was worth any price Marcus might make her pay. 3 months later, Grace gave birth to Emma Rose Hamilton at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when Dr. Wells placed the tiny, perfect baby in her arms, Grace felt a fierce protectiveness that dwarfed everything else in her life. Frank and Stella were in the waiting room, having driven to the hospital the moment Grace called. Rebecca was handling legal matters from her office, ensuring that Marcus's visitation rights were clearly defined and supervised. "She's beautiful," Stella whispered, holding Emma for the first time. "She has your eyes." Grace looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw possibility instead of limitation. Emma would grow up knowing her mother had chosen safety over wealth, dignity over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. "Any word from Marcus?" Grace asked. Frank shook his head. His lawyer called Rebecca to arrange supervised visitation, starting when Emma is 6 weeks old. Marcus is complying with the court orders. How did the criminal case resolve? Grace had been too focused on preparing for Emma's arrival to follow the legal proceedings closely. "Plea agreement," Frank reported. 6 months probation, mandatory anger management counseling, community service, and a permanent restraining order that allows contact only regarding Emma. Grace felt neither satisfaction nor disappointment. The legal consequences were less important than the personal transformation they'd all undergone. What about Hamilton Tech? Board of directors forced him out 2 weeks ago. He's starting his own consulting firm, but most of his major clients have dropped him. Grace imagined Marcus, stripped of the corporate empire that had defined his identity, forced to rebuild his professional life while facing the personal consequences of his behavior. "Do you feel sorry for him?" Stella asked gently. Grace considered the question seriously. "I feel sorry for the man he could have been if he'd chosen to treat people with respect. I don't feel sorry for the man he chose to become." "Doctor," Wells entered the room with discharge paperwork and a satisfied expression. "Everything looks excellent. Emma is healthy. Your recovery is progressing normally, and you can go home this afternoon." Home. Grace's small apartment had been transformed over the past months into a real home, painted walls, second-hand furniture arranged with care, photos of chosen family instead of wedding portraits. The marketing job Frank had found for her was going well. Working from home with flexible hours, Grace had rediscovered skills she'd forgotten she possessed. The financial independence she was rebuilding wouldn't match the luxury she'd known as Marcus's wife, but it was hers, earned through her own efforts. "There's something we need to tell you," Frank said as Grace prepared to leave the hospital. "About Romanos." "What about it?" Stella grinned. "James decided to sell the restaurant to Dad. The down payment came from Marcus's harassment settlement with one of his former employees. She insisted the money go towards something positive." Grace stared at Frank. "You own Romanos now." "As of last week. And I've been thinking about expanding the women supporting women initiatives we started after your incident. Hiring women leaving abusive relationships, providing flexible schedules for single mothers, maybe even offering childcare during shifts." "Frank, that's incredible." "It's what you inspired, Grace. Your courage gave all of us permission to dream bigger." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Grace realized that Emma was being born into a world fundamentally different from the one Grace had inhabited as Marcus's wife. Instead of isolation and control, Emma would know community and support. Instead of financial dependence, she would see her mother building independent success. The drive to Grace's apartment took them past the Hamilton estate, now empty and listed for sale. Dorothy had moved to Florida after Marcus's corporate downfall, maintaining her silence about her son's behavior, but no longer actively defending it. "Do you miss it?" Stella asked, following Grace's gaze toward the imposing mansion. "I miss the illusion of security," Grace said honestly, "but I don't miss the reality of living there." What was the reality? Grace thought about golden handcuffs, about isolation disguised as luxury, about the way wealth had been used to justify control. The reality was that I was very comfortable but completely powerless. Emma will have less money but more choices. That seems like a fair trade. Frank pulled into the parking lot of Grace's apartment complex, modest buildings surrounded by small gardens, children playing in communal areas, neighbors who knew each other's names. "Welcome home, Emma," Grace whispered to her sleeping daughter. The apartment had been prepared for their arrival. Rebecca had stocked the refrigerator, Stella had arranged flowers, Frank had installed additional security measures. The baby's room was small but perfect, painted soft yellow with second-hand furniture that had been lovingly refinished. "It's not much," Grace said, looking around the simple space. "It's everything," Frank corrected gently. "It's yours, it's safe, and it's full of people who love you both." That evening, as Grace fed Emma while Stella cooked dinner and Frank assembled the remaining baby furniture, she realized that this was what family actually looked like. Not the formal dinners and obligatory gatherings she'd known as a Hamilton, but people choosing to show up for each other day after day. "Grace," Rebecca called from the living room, where she was reviewing legal documents. "There's something you should see." Grace carried Emma to the couch, where Rebecca had spread out financial papers. "The divorce settlement is final. Marcus is required to pay child support and maintain health insurance for Emma. But you were right to refuse alimony. Why? Because it would have tied you to him financially forever. This way, you're completely independent except for his obligations to Emma." Grace looked at the numbers enough to ensure Emma's needs were met, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle Grace had known as Marcus's wife. "It's going to be tight," she said. "It's going to be yours." Rebecca replied, "Every decision, every choice, every sacrifice, and every success, it's all going to be yours." As the evening wound down and their chosen family prepared to leave, Grace found herself alone with Emma for the first time since the birth. The apartment was quiet, peaceful in a way the Hamilton estate had never been. "So," she said to her sleeping daughter, "it's just you and me now, but we're not really alone. Are we?" Emma stirred slightly, her tiny fingers grasping at air. "You're going to grow up knowing that love isn't about control, that family isn't about obligation, that women don't have to accept abuse just because it comes with financial security." Grace looked around the small apartment, her apartment, and felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The midlife transformation she'd undergone over the past months had stripped away everything she'd thought defined her: wealth, status, social position, marriage. What remained was stronger than anything Marcus's money had ever provided: the knowledge that she could survive anything, rebuild from nothing, and create a better world for her daughter. "Tomorrow we start building your life," Grace whispered to Emma. "A life where you never have to choose between safety and security, where you know your own worth isn't determined by what men think of you, where you understand that real strength comes from standing up even when you're scared." Emma's eyes opened briefly, dark and alert, as if she were listening to every word. "Welcome to the world, baby girl," Grace said. "It's going to be amazing." 2 years later, Grace stood in the kitchen of Romano's restaurant, helping Frank prepare for the evening rush while Emma played in the childcare corner they'd created for employee children. The restaurant had become a second home for both of them, a place where Grace's marketing expertise and Frank's operational skills had created something special. "The reservation system you designed is working perfectly," Frank reported, checking the evening's bookings on the tablet Grace had convinced him to adopt. "We're booked solid through next month." Grace smiled as she updated the restaurant's social media accounts. Romano's had become known throughout Connecticut as more than just a fine dining establishment. It was a symbol of community, safety, and second chances. The Women Supporting Women initiative had expanded to include job training, financial counseling, and a childcare cooperative. "Mama, look," Emma called out, showing off the drawings she'd been working on: a crayon masterpiece featuring 3 stick figures labeled Mama, Papa Frank, and Stella. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Grace said, though her heart caught slightly at Emma's casual use of Papa Frank. Her daughter had never known a world where Frank wasn't a central figure, where Stella wasn't like a beloved aunt, where family wasn't defined by choice rather than biology. Marcus saw Emma every other weekend under court-supervised visitation. He was polite, punctual, and careful to follow all legal requirements. But Grace could see the confusion in his eyes when Emma talked about Papa Frank or showed him pictures of life at Romano's. His daughter was growing up in a world he didn't understand, surrounded by people who had chosen to love her without expecting anything in return. "Grace," Stella called from the hostess station. "There's someone here to see you." Grace looked up to see Dr. Patricia Wells approaching with a warm smile and a small gift bag. "Dr. Wells, what a nice surprise. I was in the neighborhood and wanted to see how you're doing. Emma looks wonderful." Grace lifted her daughter, who immediately began chattering to the doctor about her drawing, her new words, her favorite foods. The little girl was confident, outgoing, surrounded by so much consistent love that she took it for granted. "She's thriving," Dr. Wells observed. "And so are you." Grace considered this. The past 2 years had been challenging, sleepless nights, financial struggles, the ongoing complexity of co-parenting with Marcus, but they had also been the most authentic years of her adult life. "I feel like I'm finally living my actual life instead of someone else's expectations," Grace said. "That's exactly what I hoped would happen when you left the hospital that day." Emma wiggled to be put down and ran to show her drawing to Frank, who admired it with the serious attention he gave everything she created. "She adores him," Dr. Wells noted. "Frank has been more of a father to her than her biological father ever was. He reads to her every night when we're here, teaches her about cooking, shows her how to be brave and kind." "What about Marcus?" Grace watched her daughter through the kitchen window, playing with blocks while Frank prepped vegetables nearby. "Marcus follows the visitation schedule. He takes her to expensive restaurants and toy stores, tries to impress her with things. But Emma always comes home talking about the stories Frank tells or the songs Stella teaches her. Children know the difference between attention and love," Dr. Wells observed. "Between gifts and presents." As the evening progressed, Grace found herself reflecting on the question Dr. Wells had asked during one of Emma's first checkups, "What kind of mother do you want to be?" The answer had evolved over 2 years of single parenthood, but its core remained unchanged. She wanted to be the kind of mother who taught her daughter that love was about respect, not control, that family was about choice, not obligation, that women had value beyond what they could provide for men. "Mama," Emma said as Grace prepared to leave for the night, "can Papa Frank read the princess story tonight? Papa Frank needs to work late tonight. Sweetheart, I'll read it to you. But Papa Frank does the dragon voice better." Grace laughed, remembering how Frank had initially protested that he didn't know anything about reading to children, only to discover he was naturally gifted at voices and sound effects. "Tomorrow is Sunday," Grace promised. "Papa Frank will read to you then." As they drove home to their small apartment, Emma chattering about her day, Grace realized that her daughter was growing up with something Grace had never experienced as a child: absolute security in being loved unconditionally. The financial independence Grace had rebuilt wasn't extravagant. She drove a used car, shopped sales, budgeted carefully, but it was sustainable, honorable, and entirely hers. The marketing work had led to other opportunities, freelance projects that allowed her flexibility while building a reputation in her field. "Mama," Emma said as Grace tucked her into bed that night, "why does Daddy Marcus live in a big house all by himself?" Grace paused, considering how to answer. Emma was too young to understand the full complexity of adult relationships, but she was old enough to notice that Marcus lived alone while her daily world was filled with chosen family. "Some people like to live alone," Grace said carefully. "And some people like to live surrounded by friends who feel like family. I like our way better." "Me too, sweetheart." After Emma fell asleep, Grace sat on her small balcony with a cup of tea, looking out at the modest neighborhood she now called home. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Saw the article about Romano's in Connecticut magazine. You should be proud of what you've built." Grace had been featured in the article as the marketing director who had helped transform a local restaurant into a statewide model for workplace equality and community support. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was the knowledge that her work was making a real difference in other women's lives. Another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. I read about your restaurant in the magazine. My husband hit me last week, and I don't know what to do. Can you help? Grace stared at the message, remembering her own desperation 2 years earlier, the moment when Frank and Stella had shown her that she wasn't alone. She typed back, yes, I can help. You're not alone. As she began connecting another woman to resources, shelter information, legal referrals. The support network that had grown around Romano's Grace realized that her midlife transformation had become something larger than personal recovery. She was part of a movement now, a community of women who had chosen dignity over security, truth over comfort, authentic relationships over convenient arrangements. The narcissistic abuse she had endured and overcome had given her tools to help others recognize and escape similar patterns. Her phone rang, Frank calling to check in, as he did every night. How's Emma? Asleep and happy. She asked why Marcus lives alone in such a big house. Now, what did you tell her? That some people choose to live alone, and some people choose to live surrounded by chosen family? Frank was quiet for a moment. Grace, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. What's that? Stella got the lead in that off-Broadway production. She'll be moving to New York next month. Grace felt a pang of loss mixed with pride. Stella had been auditioning consistently, building her resume, pursuing her dreams with the same determination she'd shown that night at Romano's. That's wonderful, Frank. She's worked so hard for this. She has, but it got me thinking about family, about the people we choose to keep close. What do you mean? I mean that Emma calls me Papa Frank, and you've become like a daughter to me, and Stella loves you both like we're blood relatives. Maybe it's time we made it official? Grace felt her breath catch. Official? I'm not talking about marriage. Grace, I'm talking about legal family. Adoption papers that make me Emma's grandfather in the eyes of the law. Emergency contact forms that give us legal standing to make decisions for each other. The kind of paperwork that makes chosen family into real family. Grace thought about the Hamilton family she'd married into, people connected by obligation and genetics, but divided by competition and conditional love. Then she thought about Frank, who had risked his job to protect a stranger, who read bedtime stories with dragon voices, who had never asked for anything in return for 2 years of unwavering support. Frank, she said, tears starting to fall, I would be honored to make you Emma's legal grandfather, and I would be honored to be chosen as family by 2 of the strongest women I've ever known. As Grace ended the call and prepared for bed, she looked around her small apartment, Emma's artwork on the walls, photos of their chosen family on every surface, furniture that had been gifted or earned rather than simply purchased. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she married Marcus Hamilton. It was better. Her daughter was growing up knowing that love was reliable, that adults kept their promises, that women had value beyond their ability to please men. Emma would enter the world equipped with tools Grace had spent 30 years learning, the knowledge that she deserved respect, the confidence to demand it, and the wisdom to build relationships based on mutual care rather than control. The midlife transformation that had begun with a slap in Romano's restaurant was complete. Grace had rebuilt her life from nothing, created financial independence without sacrificing emotional autonomy, and discovered that the family she chose was stronger than the family she'd been born or married into. As she drifted off to sleep, Grace heard Emma talking softly to herself in the next room, practicing the bedtime story Frank would read to her tomorrow, complete with dragon voices and princess adventures. And they all lived happily ever after, Emma whispered, because they chose to love each other every single day. Grace smiled in the darkness. Her daughter understood the most important lesson of all, that real family wasn't about blood or legal documents or financial obligations. It was about people who showed up, day after day, choosing to love each other through every challenge and celebration. The slap that had shattered Grace's marriage had also shattered her illusions about what happiness looked like. What emerged from those broken pieces was something infinitely more valuable, a life built on truth, sustained by authentic relationships, and dedicated to the radical idea that every woman deserved to live free from fear. Emma Rose Hamilton would grow up knowing she was worthy of respectful love simply because she existed. And someday, Grace thought drowsily, she would teach that lesson to her own children. And the cycle of women supporting women would continue, one generation at a time. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. And that's how Grace Hamilton transformed from a silenced victim into a beacon of hope for countless women facing similar struggles. Her daughter Emma is now growing up in a world where she knows her worth isn't defined by what men think of her, where family means people who choose to love you unconditionally, and where courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being terrified. Grace's story reminds us that it's never too late for a midlife transformation, that financial independence is worth more than financial comfort, and that sometimes the people who seem like strangers become the family you never knew you needed. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes to something new, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Share your thoughts about Grace's journey, your own experiences with finding courage in difficult moments, or simply let me know which part of the story resonated most with you. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like Grace's, stories about women finding their strength, about chosen family, about the power of standing up to bullies no matter how wealthy or powerful they are, then please hit that like button to help this story reach others who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because every week I bring you stories of real people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the courage to rebuild their lives from the ground up. These aren't fairy tales. They're reminders that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide their dignity is worth more than their comfort. Share this story with someone who needs to know they're stronger than they think, that help often comes from unexpected places, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Until next time, remember your story isn't over. Your strength is greater than you know, and sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin with the courage to close the ones that no longer serve you. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.